The waves of the Atlantic Ocean froth and boil on the beach at Biarritz on the southwest coast of France. People come here to recover their health, to enjoy the bracing air, to savour the spectacular seascapes, and to escape from busy city life. For the French, it's the edge of the world, as far as you can get from Paris and still be in France, and close to the great mountains which divide France and Spain. South and just along the coast is another small town, less well known, Saint-Jean-de-Luz, a seaport, and today something of a tourist resort. In its suburb of Ciboure, on the far side of the mouth of the harbour, sits the house where Maurice Ravel was born in 1875. It's the Basque country, an area which straddles this corner of France and northern Spain, and where the people are connected by their own distinctive language and cultural values. In the character of the people, this is represented by a fierce stubbornness and a determination to hang on to their differences. Ravel's mother came from Ciboure, so her child was born here and baptized in the lovely church behind the house. The mother had a strong character, was, surprisingly perhaps, extremely skeptical about religion, and fiercely proud of being Basque. She was to play a preeminent role in the composer's life. Ravel's father was Swiss and an engineer. He had settled in Paris, and while travelling on a job in Spain had met his wife. He supported his son's musical aspirations, and as a result Ravel respected and valued his father and was always interested in the industrial processes which his father was involved in. Although he spent the first 4 months of his life here at Saint-Jean-de-Luz, his family lived in and around Paris from then on, and he did not return here until more than 20 years later. He always was to maintain, however, that he felt Basque, but his feelings were founded more on the folk songs and language and tales he had from his mother than on any real contact with or knowledge of the country. Ravel's father was successful enough in his business, building engines and motor cars, but they tended to live near his work and not in the fashionable areas of town. One of several homes was an apartment on the top of this building in the Rue Pigalle. Then, as now, the nearby Place Pigalle and the Boulevard de Clichy was the centre of the raffish nightlife of Paris. The family had annual holidays in Switzerland, and Maurice and his brother Eduard, who eventually took over his father's business, had a close and understanding relationship, which they maintained throughout their lives. Ravel was remarkably small in stature, and from an early age had a distinctly unusual appearance. This portrait of him at 11 years of age prefigures the nattily dressed Ravel of future years. It hangs in the study of his house to this day. At the age of only 14, he entered the old Paris Conservatoire of Music to study piano. However, he was small, and so his hands were small. When he left the class about 6 years later, he was hardly any taller, and his finger stretch not much greater. Of course he was musical, and he could play extremely well, but he did not have the brilliance of his great friend and contemporary Riccardo Vines, for example, who wrote perceptively, "Ravel didn't love the piano as much as he loved music." Entering the conservatoire at the same time as Ravel, the Spaniard Riccardo Vines was only a few days older than Maurice. They were already friends, but Vines was a more experienced pianist, so he was placed 2 years ahead of Ravel. It was a further 2 years before Ravel caught up with him. With the energetic and intelligent Vines as a friend, Ravel's education, particularly in the field of literature, was not neglected. The 1890s in France was a period of great vitality in the arts. Ravel read the work of contemporaries like Paul Verlaine, of course. His earliest known composition was a setting of Verlaine's Un grand sommeil noir, which Verlaine wrote on the melancholy day when he was found guilty of shooting his lover, the poet Rimbaud, in the arm. Ravel was influenced by Baudelaire, of course, and Mallarmé, and was to set some of their works. But he also read the great classical writers like Racine and Corneille, and of course Molière, and a deep feeling for literature was to remain with Ravel throughout his life. Edgar Allan Poe was a figure on the international scene who particularly impressed him. In his essay, The Philosophy of Composition, Poe scorned those who saw art as something created in a fine frenzy. This was a view shared by Baudelaire, who translated Poe into French. This was undoubtedly to be the view of the composer Ravel throughout his life. He was to write much less than many other composers, but what he wrote was always finely crafted and considered. Very few of his works are failures. All of them, he reckoned, took a great deal of effort. Ravel was, of course, fascinated by the current trends in music. In 1889, when they started at the Conservatoire, they heard music from around the world at the great Exposition Universelle. They heard, for example, a gamelan orchestra from Java. This was fascinating too for the elder Debussy. And they went to a concert of Russian music conducted by Rimsky-Korsakov, which made a big impression on Ravel, though not on the public at large. At the Conservatoire, Mozart was his favorite composer and remained so throughout his life. This suited the traditions of the Conservatoire, but Ravel's other tastes in music were not so well received by his professors. Emmanuel Chabrier was a big influence. Chabrier had never studied at any conservatoire, and indeed for 20 years had been a civil servant before turning to music. Best known now, as then, for España, an amazingly popular orchestrated rhapsody, his appeal for Ravel lay in his wit and his exuberance, but also in his poetic sensitivity. Not long before Chabrier's death, the two students, Ravel and Viènez, played a piano duo score of Chabrier's Trois Valses Romantiques to Chabrier, seeking his advice before a performance they were to give of the work in the Conservatoire. Erik Satie lived in near poverty in Montmartre, and Ravel got to know him quite well. He lived by playing in café bars. He was derided by the orthodox musicians of the Conservatoire, but Ravel and others like Debussy recognized his unique talent and sensitivity. Ravel, in fact, never ceased to acknowledge his debt to Satie, after he had long passed Satie in fame and achievement. The English composer Frederick Delius lived near Paris at this time, and it is no surprise that Ravel was influenced by this English composer and his music. Delius was all but French, however, living in this charming house at Grès-sur-Loing for almost 40 years. There were other pianists at the Conservatoire at this time, notably Alfred Cortot and Marguerite Long, along with Viènez, who were to have great success as performing artists. All performed Ravel's music well, but even after being turned out of the piano class of the Conservatoire at the age of 20, Ravel continued to study the piano privately. Finally, he accepted that composition was his path, and he returned to the Conservatoire after a break of 3 years. The deciding factor for this move was perhaps that the distinguished composer Edgar Fauré, who Ravel greatly admired, was appointed director of the Conservatoire. Somehow, Fauré had the gift of being able to get along with people of different views. Anyway, Ravel could respect a man who could write such music as he did. Ravel's course through the Conservatoire for the second time was not without its problems, in spite of Fauré's efforts. he was asked to leave the harmony and piano classes as his work was not considered up to standard. Not long after this, his Menuet Antique and Habanera, 2 works for piano, were published. It was his first and most important step up the professional ladder. Habanera, in particular, is a fine work. It was to be a characteristic of Ravel's extraordinary talent that although he wrote far less than most composers do, he wrote magnificently almost all the time. His next works, written of course while he was still a student at the Conservatoire, whose staff had such a low opinion of him, included the Pavane pour une infante défunte, which is still today constantly performed in its original piano version and also in the version for orchestra. The Scheherazade Rhapsody, performed first only after strenuous promotion by Fauré, is also still hugely successful. The Conservatoire, however, considered all this so worthless that he was disbarred from entering for the Prix de Rome in the year 1900. Rather surprisingly for someone who thought so little of officialdom and its opinions, Ravel persisted in trying for it. Perhaps this was because it had been won in the past by such men as Berlioz, Gounod, Bizet, Massenet, and Debussy. In 1901, he got through the first round only, but in successive years and up to 1905, his last chance within the age limit, he was consistently thrown out. When he was finally dropped from the first round of the 1905 Prix, it was clear to many that it was a political move on the part of the old guard of professors. The matter became something of a scandal, and it certainly succeeded in putting Ravel off the establishment in music forever. Piano music was for Ravel preeminently important, though works first written for the piano often appeared as orchestral works too. It must be said that this was never just a matter of recycling. As with almost everything he wrote, his orchestrations were masterly, and it is hard to say that the piano or orchestral version of a particular work is definitive. Although he never had any formal schooling other than what he got at the Conservatoire, Ravel was extremely intelligent and never failed to follow all the musical and intellectual movements of his day. Indefatigably, when Debussy's magical and epoch-making opera Pelléas and Mélisande was launched in 1902, Ravel went to all of the 29 performances given. In the same year, Ravel began his string quartet in F, quite obviously under the influence of Debussy. It was an instant success and remains one of the most popular quartets in the repertoire. As if he felt that he dealt with the quartet form, he wrote no others. In 1904, in 8 days, he wrote the introduction and allegro for harp, flute, clarinet, and string quartet. It was his first commissioned work, and it had the graceful perfection that seemed to come so easily to him. Ravel was to write well for singers. One of his earliest essays in this direction was a setting of poems by Jules Renard called Histoire naturelle. Renard himself couldn't see what a composer had to add, and when the work was performed by Ravel and the soprano Jane Battari, it was greeted by jeers and boos. Ravel was never put off by such a reception, perhaps because he never lacked ardent support from the people that mattered to him most, like Fauré and later Debussy. Ravel was a charming man, fastidiously, even fancily dressed. He was never known to have a lover of either sex. His lifelong friendship with the poet and writer Léon Paul Fargue some have suggested might have been deeper and more significant than it appeared. Certainly his relationship with his mother had an Oedipal intensity. However, he quite often declared that love was not for artists. But of any really deep personal relationships we know nothing, and it seems there were none. This is not unusual among artists, but it definitely coloured his work, particularly in his many pieces for the theatre. Ravel had a strong visual imagination. His home in Montfort, outside Paris, where he eventually moved after several rootless years following his mother's death, is full of his own designs and evidence of his subtle mind. He designed the wallpapers and even executed the friezes himself. Every room of the tiny house bears his imprint. It is not surprising to find him early on in his career writing for the theatre. Later in life he had a flat in his brother's house in Paris, and its stark 1920s style decoration was perfectly in keeping with the times and Ravel's close identification with it. With his settings of Jules Renard's Histoire naturelle, Ravel made his first move into writing music with an imaginative text as starting point. His first opera, L'Heure Espagnole, based on a comedy by Frank Nohan. It had many attractions, a Spanish background and mechanical clocks, to say no more. He was always attracted by machines and mechanical toys. L'Heure Espagnole was funny too, and it had ridiculous rhymes. In short, it suited him perfectly, and he composed it in 3 months in the summer of 1907. Durand published the score, but it did not get a performance until 1911. Around this time, the English composer Ralph Vaughan Williams, several years older than Ravel, arrived seeking lessons from the French composer. Ravel worked with him on orchestration, and the two became firm friends. Ravel was later to visit Vaughan Williams in London. From Ravel, Vaughan Williams sought a kind of musical impressionism, while in fact Ravel's music was taking a new direction, paralleled perhaps by Matisse and Derain, with their bold, harsh colours and a degree of psychological realism which exactly suited Ravel. With Rhapsodie Espagnole, Ravel began his contact with Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. The work, of course, while Spanish and immensely and immediately attractive, as Ravel's music usually is, has a brittle quality. Such pieces meant that Ravel was quickly being recognized as one of the greatest figures of French music. If his works did not pour out in a steady stream, when they came, they rarely missed the mark. In Daphnis and Chloé, Ravel found, or rather contrived to develop, a subject which suited him. In other hands, it might have been expected to be an erotic love story. In Ravel's hands, it would be wrong to say it is not sensuous music, for Ravel's music is usually extremely sensuous, but as a story of the passion of two young lovers, in Ravel's hands, the passion seems to disappear. Placed beside the pagan loves of Stravinsky's The Firebird, performed by the Ballet Russe at the same time, Ravel's lovers seem idealized and closer perhaps to the 18th than the 20th century. He finished Daphnis and Chloé while staying at Saint-Jean-de-Luz, his birthplace, and now become, more intellectually than by real identification, part of his spiritual birthright. The music of Daphnis and Chloé, in the form of an orchestral suite, is constantly performed in concert halls around the world today. As a ballet in Diaghilev's hands, however, it never made a great success. Ravel was always close to and interested in the political and social events of his time. He was devastated by the war and tried, ineffectually because of his poor health, to join up. In 1915, he was finally accepted as a driver and saw service in the front areas at Verdun, where this photograph was taken. He was much affected by the brutalism and futility of it, although he felt as strongly as anyone the need to resist the aggressor. An organization calling itself the National League for the Defense of French Music, which had no less figures than Saint-Saëns and Vincent d'Indy as members, tried to make the argument that German and Austrian music should be banned from performance in France. Ravel would have none of it and roundly condemned it as nonsense. What had the Austrian Schoenberg's nationality got to do with the quality of his music? Bartók and Kodály reflected Hungarian folk music in their compositions. Was one to condemn them for being Hungarian? War distorts the human spirit, but Ravel, fighting for his country, knew his view was right and could not harm him. Ravel was finally invalided out of the army for a time. He returned to Paris to find his mother seriously ill. She died in January 1917. For most people, the death of a beloved parent is a tragic experience. For Ravel, it was much more than this, and he never ceased to grieve for her for the rest of his life. After the end of the war, and a long period when he could write nothing, La Valse was the last work written for Diaghilev. It is a haunting, decadent, and yet irresistible piece, and it is in the repertoire of every orchestra the world over. When Stravinsky and Diaghilev heard it, its very qualities of pastiche and ultimately near brutality, which made it so much work of Ravel's, actually repelled them. Diaghilev described it as a masterpiece, but he couldn't see it as a ballet. And Stravinsky couldn't find a word to say about it. This led to an unfortunate cooling off of the long friendship between the two composers. Up to this point, Stravinsky had championed Ravel. They had even worked together. Perhaps now, Stravinsky was hearing something he knew was completely original, and it unnerved him in the terrible post-war period when everything they had all known was changing so wildly, and in his own work he was struggling to find direction. Whatever it was, once Ravel was offended, there was not much could be done about it. Ravel inspired devoted friendship in a number of people. Hélène Jourdan-Morange, for example, to whom his violin sonata is dedicated. She wrote a wonderfully sympathetic memoir of the composer after his death. And, of course, Ramon Vinés, the pianist, and his great friend from his first days at the Conservatoire. His friends visited him at his home in Montfort, giving him surprise parties, constantly supporting him in his endeavours, and sympathetic in their conversation, letters, and company to his wide and sophisticated tastes in literature and the arts in general. By the 20s, Ravel was a world celebrity. The Americas called, and he conducted his music in all the musical centres of the world. In this photograph, he's with George Gershwin and others in New York. He returned from this trip with the tidy sum of $27,000. Quite a fortune in the 20s. In France in 1920, an attempt was made to honour him by making him a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur. However, it was done without his knowledge and acceptance. Perhaps he had the feeling that officialdom, which had not recognized his talent with the Prix de Rome when he was a student, was not more likely to recognize it now. Anyway, he refused it, creating quite a scandal. He played and conducted all over Great Britain, where his music is ever popular. At Oxford he was made a Doctor of Music, and it seemed that he was fast becoming a part of musical history, superseded by the younger forces of the day. However, with his opera L'Enfant et les Sortilèges, staged in 1925 in Monte Carlo, he made something quite unique. He had not lost his touch. The libretto was by the popular novelist Colette, who with her scandal-ridden background seems an unlikely collaborator. But they had known each other for many years, and somehow the chemistry worked and a strange and magical piece emerged. 2 piano concertos brought him back into the more abstract field of orchestral music. The one for the left hand, an amazingly successful work for a pianist who lost his right hand in the war. In 1925 he wrote Bolero, perhaps the best known of all his works, performed too often, some would say. No one who hears it for the first time, however, can quite forget it, and it has much that is best in Ravel, entertaining and riveting, but also with its own acid harshness and astonishing force. Ravel's qualities were quite unique. Very often his music got a warm initial reception, which was followed by the perception that people had got more than they thought on first hearing. From the war onwards, his health was never very stable, and even as a young man, much of his working life was coloured by a variety of physical illnesses. In the early 1930s, he began to suffer neurological problems, which led to his death in December 1937. Few artists lead serene lives. Ravel's personal life seems barren in most people's eyes, and this is reflected in the small scale of his works and their ultimate lack of emotional depth, something it seems fairly clear he was aware of. Few composers, however, are blessed with his astonishingly attractive talent, originality, and technical brilliance. Most people who become familiar with his music find they form a personal relationship with it, which is quite special. This is surely legacy enough for any man to leave. Ravel was not a prolific composer by most standards, but what he wrote was of the highest quality. It falls into roughly 5 groups. Piano music, he was a fine pianist and wrote brilliantly for the instrument. Chamber music for small and varying groups of instruments. Songs, usually for voice and piano. Orchestral music, and stage works, either ballet music or operas. Piano music. Ravel composed over 50 works for the piano, either individual works or in small groups. The Menuet Antique and Habanera were his first published works. He was still a student at the Conservatoire. The Habanera is particularly fine. With the Pavane pour une enfante défunte, published in 1900, Ravel produced one of his most enduring works, though perhaps best known in its orchestral version. Jeu d'eau of 1901 is Ravel exploding a magical expression of a fountain of water, musical impressionism of the highest order. Durand published his Sonatine in 1905 and offered him a retainer for the right to publish his music in the future. He had arrived. With Miroir in 1905, he moved on from the impressionism of Jeu d'eau. There is still charm, but the charm is laced with acid and melancholy. Ma Mère Loy, the Mother Goose Suite, was a children's piano duet, later turned into a ballet. A collection of 3 pieces called Gaspard de la Nuit was based on eerie poems by Aloysius Bertrand. One of the group Le Gibet, the gibbet, is particularly haunting. Valse noble et sentimentale. This work was ill-received by its first audience, who were shocked by its brutality. Very soon afterwards he made an orchestral version. The last piano work to mention is Le Tombeau de Couperin. Ravel called it a French suite, and it is a sort of tribute to the French suite of the 18th century. Chamber music. In a period of enthusiasm for the music of Debussy, Ravel wrote his string quartet in F, popular from its first performance in 1902. The introduction and allegro for harp, flute, clarinet and strings was his first commissioned work. It is quite delightful. 3 poems by Mallarmé for voice, piano, strings, 2 flutes and 2 clarinets is quite different in style and placed Ravel squarely amongst the most modern composers of his day. There is a piano trio in A major and a sonata for violin and cello. There are 3 works for violin and piano, a berceuse, the Tzigane Rhapsody, a stunning and virtuoso piece, and a sonata written for and first performed by his old friend Georges Enescu. Orchestral music. Scheherazade for voice and orchestra was an early success. With Rhapsody Espagnole, Ravel began to reveal his mastery of orchestration, which with its immense vigour makes the work ever popular. La Valse was written first as a ballet after the First World War, but it is as a concert piece that it has made its mark. Bolero is probably amongst the most popular concert works of all time. In the late 20s, after he'd recovered a little from the effects of the war, he wrote a piano concerto for the one-handed player Paul Wittgenstein, and another piano concerto performed first by his old friend Marguerite Long. Songs. Ravel wrote 32 songs, usually for voice and piano. Amongst these are songs grouped under the title Histoire naturelle, which give witty musical interpretations of the creatures written about by the poet Jules Renard. The first audience expected melodies, so they were scandalized at what they got. The 5 Mélodies populaires grecques are light and charming and quite different, although written in the same year. Chansons Madagasques, Madagascan songs for voice, flute, cello and piano are settings of poems by an 18th century poet called Évariste Parnet. They were completed in April 1924. There is a piano version. Stage works. L'Heure Espagnole is a one-act comic opera written in 1907. It was produced in the Opéra Comique in Paris in 1911. La Mère Loy, the Mother Goose piano duet, was turned into a ballet with additional scenes and produced in January 1912. Adélaïde was a ballet version of Valse noble et sentimentale, created in March 1912. Daphnis and Chloé was commissioned by Diaghilev for the Ballet Russe, and with choreography by Fokine, it opened in June 1912. Although the ballet was not successful, as an orchestral suite, it is one of the most popular works in the concert repertoire. La Valse was also commissioned by Diaghilev, but he refused it. It too is still immensely popular as a concert work. L'Enfant et les Sortilèges, a one-act opera with a libretto by Colette, was given by the Monte Carlo Opera in 1925. The essence of Ravel is to be found in the string quartet in F major, the Chansons Madagasques for voice, flute, cello and piano, or in the piano version, the piano suite Tombeau de Couperin, and in the orchestral suite made from the ballet Daphnis and Chloé.